Hello, and welcome to Our Special Lives. I'm Laura McGrath, and today we are talking to a very special guest, Jolene Philo, who is going to talk to us about love languages for special needs parents. And before we get started, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Jolene Philo has a master's degree in education and is an educator-turned-author who was a caregiver to both her father with a disability and her son with special needs. Jolene has written many books for parents of children with special needs, including the book that we're talking about today, Sharing Love Abundantly in Special Needs Families, the 5 love languages for parents raising children with disabilities, which she co-authored with Gary Chapman. Jolene, welcome to Our Special Lives.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I want to talk about the 5 love languages for parents raising children with disabilities. I had previously read the original 5 love languages book by Gary Chapman, and it's probably one of the most influential books that I've read on relationships and connection in relationships. So let's start our talk by filling the audience in case they don't know, on the 5 love languages. Can you briefly go through the premise of why we are using love languages, and then maybe a little bit about each love language itself?
Sure. Well, these love language, this theory was developed by Dr. Gary Chapman, and he originally used it with couples as a way of enhancing communication in marriages and relationships. And what he believes is that we are all born with a primary love language. And that's the one we speak to other people to show them love. And that's when someone speaks that love language to us, we feel very loved. The problem is that very often in a marriage or between a parent and a child or whoever, you don't speak the same love language. And so I may be, and I do, speak my love language to my husband. My love language is acts of service. His is physical touch. And so I speak it to him to show him I love him, but it doesn't really mean that much to him. And then he speaks his love language to me and gives me a hug or a kiss. And that doesn't really mean as much to me as it would if he would offer to set the table or something like that. So the premise behind the love languages is that we have to figure out our love language. We have to figure out the other person's love language. And then we have to learn to speak that person's love language so we both feel loved. And so those 5 love languages are, I already mentioned, acts of service, and that's doing intentional things for someone else that mean a lot to them. And the key there is it needs to be what that person wants done, not what you think that they want to have done for them. And I also mentioned physical touch. That's another love language. Now, this is a non-sexual physical touch. It's the kind of touch that's hugging, maybe holding hands when you pray before a meal, giving your spouse a kiss before they go to work and when they come home, rubbing their back, ruffling a child's hair. Those are examples of physical touch. Another one of them is words of affirmation, and that is speaking words that encourage the other person. They can take the form of compliments or just encouraging or just giving feedback like, oh, I really appreciate it when you do this. You do it so well. So, and it can be written or it can be spoken. Either one can be words of affirmation. Another one is quality time, and this is just spending time with someone else. And it's quality time because sitting next to each other on the couch and scrolling through your phones doesn't count as quality time. Quality time is when you engage in something together. Maybe you go for a walk together, or you play a game, or you could watch a television show together and talk about it as it unfolds. And then the final one is receiving and giving gifts. Now, these are the people who love it if you bring them a little something. And they're the ones that if they come to your house, they'll bring a hostess gift, or they'll insist on bringing something to share at the meal because that's their language. And then they love to receive things in return, but it can also be things like cards. It doesn't have to be expensive. It can be something small like a found object. I had one person in the book who said her son's message was love language is receiving gifts. And when her coworkers found that out, and they also knew he loved to make things out of cardboard, they started saving cardboard tubes and cardboard boxes, and she would bring them home, and he felt extremely loved. So it doesn't have to be expensive at all.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a terrific overview. My husband definitely loves acts of service, and I'm more words of affirmation. And so we're still, kind of trying to sort that out a little bit because he does something for me, like brings me a cup of coffee or that kind of thing that he would like to get. And sometimes just knowing that that's his love language and that he's trying to show me love, I can kind of put it through that filter of, even though it's not my particular love language, he is showing me love in the way that he feels it. So even if you don't get it totally right, just being aware of the love language can actually improve your relationship.
That's right. And it's kind of like being bilingual. If my love language is acts of service and my primary language is English, I can learn to speak Spanish. I can learn to do physical touch, but I'm never going to be as fluent at it as I am with my primary language. And that's okay. Very often, just the fact when someone realizes you're trying to speak their language, that makes them feel loved.
So in the book, you talk about how to use the love languages in 3 different ways. One way is between parents who are co-parenting a child with special needs. The second is between the parent and special needs child. And then the third is between the parent and a typical child or a sibling of the child with special needs. So can you kind of maybe walk us through that a little bit and maybe give us some examples?
Mm-hmm. Sure. The thing we have to remember when we're talking about parents who are co-parenting a child with special needs, and if you're one of those people in the audience, you know this very well, but for those of you who are watching and trying to figure out how to help somebody in your life who's caring for a child with special needs, know that there's a lot of stress and time commitment that parents who are raising children with special needs expend every day. They use a lot of energy on care. A lot of their finances go towards care. A lot of their time goes to it. And they deal with a lot of things that stress a relationship between the parents, make it really hard for their marriage or their relationship to stay strong. And so it's really important in the face of all those stressors to be intentional with your partner about expressing love to them. And the great thing is that the love languages make it a lot easier. Once you know your spouse's love language, you can speak it to him or her, and you can speak it much more effectively and intentionally. If you know they like quality time, well, then you can make sure you set aside maybe 10 minutes before you fall asleep at night to just sit and talk with your partner, or whatever that situation might be. If you know they like gifts, just make a dessert or even pick one up at the bakery and serve it on your nice dishes to them. That can be a gift to them. It doesn't have to be hard. It just needs to be intentional. So that's what you can do with your spouse. And it's really important to start there, because if your relationship with your partner or your spouse is strong, your child is going to benefit. The child with special needs and the typical siblings too. Now, in relationship with typical siblings, they have a tendency to be overlooked. I grew up, when you mentioned that I helped care for my father, that wasn't when my father was older. He was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis when I was 2. And we were raised in a home where we were caring for Dad. He was in a wheelchair very soon after that. And we were asked to do a lot of things that maybe weren't quite appropriate for children, but we did them because that was our life and Mom needed help. And that happens a lot with typical siblings too. And what that does, even though it's okay sometimes, and every parent I have talked to, and in my own life, I know this to be true, that for the typical siblings, they become, for the most part, stronger and more compassionate people. So it is okay for them to learn to serve within that family, but we have to make sure that we provide a space for them to be children. We have to let them be kids. We can't expect them to be constant caregivers. So that might mean you and your partner tag teaming. So on a Saturday morning, One of you stays with the child who has special needs and does things with them, and the other parent takes the typical child out for ice cream if they like quality time, or out for ice cream if they like gifts, because it works both ways, or out for ice cream and then you tell them all the wonderful things about them that you've noticed during the week. There's words of affirmation. So you can use the same activity depending on their love language to make sure that they hear you speaking love loud and clear. And then provide some space too for them to be in situations where they get to experience things that other families do. And this can take some work. I had an aunt and uncle who lived in the same town where we did, and they took us camping with them, something my father couldn't do. I will never forget the day my uncle came over to help. I don't know if it was clear a gutter in our roof, and we had a ranch house. So when he had that ladder up, he made my brother and sister and I, well, he didn't make us, he helped us climb the ladder and stand on the roof, because that was something that we couldn't do otherwise. You know, our dad couldn't do that with us, and mom was too busy caring for everybody to do it. So you've got to maybe create those. Maybe there's a neighbor who could do some of those things, a relative, someone from your church who would be willing to come in and do those activities with the child. Or maybe you can even find a camp that caters to a whole special needs family and it has activities for everybody, including the typical siblings. Those things are out there. So that's one way to think about the love languages of typical siblings. And then, of course, with our children who have special needs, what we need to do is figure out how to use the love languages in ways that are appropriate with their needs. So if they have an intellectual disability, you're going to have to figure out how to accommodate for those needs. So you may have a 25-year-old, but if that 25-year-old has the emotional ability of a 5-year-old and wants to snuggle in bed, and have a bedtime story at night because physical touch and quality time are their love languages, well, that's appropriate for them. Go ahead and do that for that child. Or whatever their need or their level of ability might be. It could be someone who has Asperger's syndrome who's very, very high functioning. There's one mom that said that, her son's love language was words of affirmation, but to get him to accept that compliment, he would constantly kind of debate with her about it. And he finally told her, "Mother, you're a very good debater. Thank you for that compliment." So you have to figure out how you're going to speak to your child. It just makes it a little harder, but it's not impossible. And I interviewed like 40 families for this book, and they had children all over the map, depending in regards to what their special needs were. And the ideas they had for each of the love languages and ways to adapt them are in lists in the end of every chapter of the book, because I wanted to give you as many possibilities as you could have, so you could select the ones that you think will work with your child.
Yeah, those lists are very, very helpful. And I just want to point out to the audience that, and I'll link to your book below, of course, but in the book, you have quizzes that each of the spouse or the child, who may be the typical sibling, can take, and then you can sort of figure out, and that you yourself can take, that tells you what your love language is. And typically there's, one primary and maybe a close secondary. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I thought was interesting was how you go into figuring out what a kind of more involved child, or a child who may be nonverbal, what their love languages are. Can you walk through that with the audience?
I sure can. And those quizzes are at the end of chapter 1, and they include the quizzes for spouses or partners. They include quizzes for children and quizzes for teens. And they also tell you how to do a certain game that you can do with younger children between the ages of 5 and 8 to help figure out their love languages. And I think the important thing to remember is, again, if you have a 25-year-old who is maybe at an intellectual level of a 12-year-old, they might want to take the child's test and be able to do the quiz. But if that's not going to work, and I know that doesn't work in a lot of cases, maybe your child is nonverbal or can't read, or their developmental level is more of that of a 5 or 6-year-old, and you can't figure it out. One of the methods to use, and this is actually mentioned by Dr. Chapman in his book for children, but we kind of adapted it for kids with special needs, is that you play an observation game. And so you intentionally use one of the love languages for a week or two. You could even go 3 weeks, but that might be a little excessive. And then have a journal. So you try acts of service for a week or so. So you're trying to do things for your child. Maybe you offer to make the bed. Maybe you bring them some cocoa in the evening, or whatever it might be. And you write down in your journal how they react to that, how they respond. The next week, you might go on to quality time and see how they respond when you play a game together, or go for a walk together, or just sit down and talk over the day. And then you move on to physical touch and see how they respond to being tickled, or having their hair ruffled, or roughhousing, or sitting close to you, or sitting on your lap while you read a book. And then you move on to the next one and the next one, always recording what you've noticed. And you will probably, by the end of that time period, after you've tried all of them, you will see that there is one of them that they maybe respond more to. A lot of parents described it as, my child lights up when and you've probably hit their love language when you know what makes them light up. But if that doesn't work and you're still not sure, one of the very wise parents, they have a daughter who is autistic. She can communicate, but her communication skills are not always easy, or the parents have a hard time interpreting them. So they ask themselves, what calms my child? What motivates my child within the 5 love language? So which love language calms my child the most? Which one motivates my child the most? And then when my child has time to choose, which one do they choose for themselves? What, in their free time, what do they gravitate towards? And if you can answer those 3 questions, you've probably figured out their love language. Now, if the child's too young for that, or their disabilities just make it hard to figure it out, use all 5 languages with your child. Because for the first 4 years of life, we need to be using all 5 love languages. Kids need words of affirmation, quality time, acts of service constantly. Physical touch, we sit with them, we cuddle them, and then all of those are gifts we give to our kids. And they need all 5 of those to become secure adults. That's how they need to experience love. And so if you simply cannot figure out your child's love language, just use all 5 and you will have it covered.
I love that. I'm aware of our time, and you've been so kind to spend this time with us. I just had one more thing that I wanted to talk about, which is in one of the later chapters in the book, you talk about once you figure out your special needs child's love language, you can then use that information to build better connections with their doctors, their therapists, maybe their teachers, without specifically coming out and saying, my child's love language is touch, or my child's love language is words of affirmation. You can kind of finesse that language and really use that so that your child either feels safer at the doctor's office, or more supported in school. Can you kind of talk about that?
Sure. The key there, and having been a teacher, I can attest to this, is that you have to figure out how to translate the love languages into the jargon of whoever the professional is. And I had a lot of parents say that they have their child's love languages basically written into the IEP. So a mom who's got a child who is 5 years old and likes to hug, their love language is physical touch, and loves to hug, one of his IEPs is learning to give appropriate hugs. He wanted to get up and hug everybody who came into the room, which isn't appropriate. So when it's appropriate to give a hug and how often, that was part of his IEP. Now, there was a 16-year-old who also has the same love language. And his IEP was about how to express, how to communicate physically in an appropriate way. So for him, it was no hugs, because for a 16-year-old boy, that's not something that they can be doing at school at all. So they were working with him on, can he high five? Can he do a fist bump? Can they create a secret handshake? You know, what is there that they can do so that that love language is being met at school? And that was very successful. Others, often if the child is sensory sensitive, it might be they will respond, and this could be in the PT office or at school, depending on what's being worked on, that they need deep pressure massage. If they work with a physical therapist in the school or out of school, that was one that was very common. Or, you know, that they just need, they're sensory sensitive, or they have sensory overload, and so you can write it into their IEP or whatever that way. Another one is for words of affirmation or quality time or receiving gifts. This will work. Kind of, it can be a behavioral reward. So the reward is time playing a game with the teacher, or the reward is compliments, or the reward is a sticker on a chart, depending on what their love language is. So any of those can be used, because, and schools and hospitals and doctors appreciate knowing that information, because we all know that when children feel loved and they feel safe, they learn better and they heal faster. So the more of that information you can work in a conversation with professionals who work with your kids, the better.
Jolene, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your very inspiring story with us, as well as passing on some of your great wisdom in this area. And I want to thank so much the audience for joining us. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. And please send us a comment or drop us a line at ourspeciallives.com. We'd love to hear from you.